Children and adults, we aim to invite on stage Mr. Michael Holgate, Deputy Director of British Council India, to deliver the welcome address.
The event is the Beatles and India.
Really warm welcome to the British Council. So my name is Michael Holgate. I'm the British Council's Deputy Director in India. And I'm also British Council India's resident Beatles fan. And so it's an enormous pleasure for me to be able to welcome you all to tonight's event, a screening of this acclaimed documentary, The Beatles and India, and then a conversation between the director, Ajoy Bose, and celebrated journalist Veer Sanghvi. So the British Council is all about connections, building connections. Connect people together through a shared love of music. People from completely different cultural backgrounds, people who might not speak the same language or understand each other's values or understand where each other are coming from, can still feel connected to each other through a music that has a truly universal appeal. But more than that, I think Beatles are the absolute masters of connecting different cultural forms together. And to my mind, there's really no one better at taking a huge range of different influences from around the world and connecting them together and molding them into something new and magical. And so in my job to build connections, and as a lifelong Beatles fan, really nothing gives me more pleasure than connecting people around the world to the music of the Beatles. Now, when I say I'm a lifelong Beatles fan, I want to emphasize the lifelong part of that. Some of my very earliest memories as a preschool child, as a toddler, 3-4 years old, are listening to Beatles records. My father used to play me his old vinyl Beatles records when I was very small. Now, like everyone, my musical tastes have evolved as I've gotten older. I had a Metallica phase as a teenager, and a folk phase in my 20s, and a jazz phase in my 30s. But throughout the vicissitudes of my changing musical taste, really the only thing that has remained constant has been the Beatles. I loved the Beatles when I was 4 years old, and I loved the Beatles when I was 21 years old, and I love the Beatles now that I'm in my late 30s. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason why the Beatles stay constant, I think the reason why the Beatles endure, and I think the reason why they stay fresh, is because of what I was just saying about the different influences. As I say, they're the masters of taking all these different diverse influences from all over the place and creating something new. And it means the Beatles' music has got so many different aspects to it, so many different layers to it. And so it always stays fresh and the legacy endures. If we just look at some of these layers, rock and roll, obviously, and skiffle music, but also folk music, and country music, Motown, soul music, English music hall, Broadway show tunes. There's a whole range of non-musical influences that are so strong in the Beatles' work, from Salvador Dali to Spike Milligan. But of course, and very pertinent to today's discussion, there are any number of influences from India on their work, from Ravi Shankar to the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Now for me, the Indian influence on the Beatles goes back to my very earliest memories of listening to the Beatles. My father used to play me the Sgt. Pepper album, and as a 3-4-year-old, my very favourite song was When I'm 64. Now, Beatles fans will know that that's the second song on the second side of Sgt. Pepper, and so to listen to it, you have to get through Within You, Without You first, which is one of the Beatles' sort of most noticeably Indian songs. And so my earliest memories of the Beatles are, very tied up with this Indian influence on the Beatles' music. But songs like Within You, Without You, which is sort of this very, very distinctly Indian in form, in lyric, in instrumentation, these sort of Indian songs are the most obvious example of the Indian influence. But if you peel back some more of the layers, you'll see so many more subtle influences from India on the Beatles' music. The Beatles were famously the first Western group to use sitars in their songs, but they were also one of the first Western groups to use harmoniums in a lot of their songs in their middle period. This is a Western instrument which then became very widely used in India. stopped being used in the West and then was reintroduced to the West by the Beatles. The Beatles applied a lot of Indian techniques to otherwise sort of standard rock songs. I remember reading this really interesting interview with George Harrison when he was talking about, in Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, the lead guitar line echoing the vocal line, which is not a technique that's found in any part of the Western canon, either in rock music or in classical music, but it's very common in Hindustani classical music. We see obviously expressions of Indian or Hindu philosophy in the lyrics to some of the Beatles songs. And then what's also interesting is sort of the non-Indian influence of India. So the finger-picking guitar style that dominates the White Album was learned by the Beatles in India. Now, it was taught to the Beatles by another British guitar player, but it took India to bring them together and for that skill to be transferred. So all of this is to say that I think the influence of India on the Beatles is one of the main reasons why their music remains so compelling and their legacy remains so enduring. India's had this huge impact on deepening the richness of one of the UK's best bands. And going back to the British Council point of view, as an organisation that tries to bring together the best of UK and Indian culture, I think the Beatles' engagement with India is really one of the best examples we have of UK and Indian cultural synergy. India and the UK coming together to make something new and magical. And I hope that this magic comes across during the screening and the discussion this evening. So this evening we're going to hear, first of all, from Ajoy Bose, who's the director, to tell us a little bit about the documentary. Then we're going to see the film itself, and then there's going to be a discussion between Ajoy and Veer Sanghi. And then at the end we'll hear some reflections from the High Commissioner, who will be joining us later on. She's in a meeting right now and is coming here soon. So I'm just going to quickly introduce the speakers before handing over. So Ajoy Bose is the director of the documentary. He's also the author of the book Across the Universe, The Beatles in India, on which the documentary is based. He's an acclaimed Indian journalist, author, filmmaker, with a distinguished career spanning over 4 decades. He's been widely recognized for his insightful storytelling, deep understanding of India's socio-cultural landscape. His work often bridges global narratives, like this work on the Beatles and India. Beatles in India is his first film as director, but it's won numerous awards, including winner of the Best Film, Audience Choice, and the Best Music at the 2021 UK Asian Film Festival, and it was also closing film at the New York Indian Film Festival in 2022. Ajoy will be in conversation with Veer Sanghi, who's a celebrated Indian print and television journalist, author, columnist, and talk show host, known for his versatility and engaging style. He's written extensively on culture, on politics, and on gastronomy. Born in London, educated at Oxford, his global outlook and connections make him a prominent voice in cultural discussions that resonate on both Indian and British platforms. Thank you so much, Ajoy and Veer, for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll hand back now to Anupama. Thank you.
Meet Mr. J. Bose.
You can see a packed house. Just a few words before the screening. We don't want to talk too long before you see the film. Firstly, thanks very much to the British Council. It played a huge role in post-colonial India. We, of course, have heard about the influence that India had on the Beatles. I think the Beatles had a tremendous influence on people like us, the Beatles generation of youngsters growing up, hearing stories about the British Raj and what should be, what was an Englishman, what was the West, and between the ruler and the ruled. And the British and the Beatles really changed that perception. I think it was beyond music. I think what the Beatles represented, and to some extent what the entire decade of the 60s which was an amazing, amazing decade, which shifted entirely the cultural norms and cultural paradigm, really. So the Beatles really led that. And what is amazing about the Beatles was that they were pop stars, they were rock stars, and therefore their influence happened not in just few intellectual circles, but it happened on a large scale. They were responsible for making that small trickle of hippies who were coming to India into this flood of young people coming here. And it changed, you looked at the hippie, you looked at the Beatles, and they were so totally different from memories of the Raj, of what the British were. And I think it led to a bond which remains today. And I think this people-to-people contact was amazing. This, of course, the film deals with all that. And I think that a mistake we make is that we emphasize only the Indian influence on the Beatles' music. And it is true that Indian music did open up certain doors for the Beatles in musical terms. But if you notice, there are not that many Beatles songs which are really Indian in content. And George himself gave up playing the sitar because he realized he had, despite having a teacher like Ravi Shankar, he didn't really, have the time really to learn the sitar properly. But I think what it did really, and to some extent, having coincided with them experimenting with hallucinatory drugs, is really opened up their minds. And at a time when the Beatles wanted to reinvent themselves, and that's the amazing thing about the Beatles, because the Beatles already were hugely successful. And despite all that money and fame, being the world's most popular pop star, despite having those screaming teenage fans, they were not satisfied and they wanted to be something else. And I think that is really unique about the Beatles, that they evolved. They constantly wanted to be different. George had his philosophical questions. John had his demons inside which made him restless all the time. Paul wanted to build the Beatles as a brand, and the best brand in the world. And Ringo, of course, was up for anything. I mean, he just wanted to play with the world's best band. But, I mean, what I'm saying is that grappling, these are 4 working class boys from Liverpool, grappling with Indian, not just Indian music, but Indian culture, Indian spirituality, is something which is quite amazing. Quite amazing. And that they did it, and they actually managed to use it so effectively in creating this music. And what you look at the Beatles, and something most striking about them is that most bands have a beginning, and then they reach a peak, and then they slide down. The Beatles went out with a bang. Probably their best music was at the very end. So I think India played a role. So I'm not going to speak more, because I think you see the film, and then Veer and I can explore all these questions further. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming, and let's see the film.
The film.